welcome you all to our June Hungry for History. Our June Hungry for History. This is our second in a quarterly series this year celebrating the U.S. 250th anniversary. And this month we're welcoming Dr. Christopher Hendricks and for his talk, The Battle of Savannah from the American Perspective. And I'll just give you a little taste. In September, Rita Elliott's going to come and she's going to talk about archaeology in Savannah that focused on the Revolutionary War. So that one's going to be pretty exciting. Today, though, I'll introduce our speaker. Dr. Hendricks is a professor of history at Armstrong campus of Georgia Southern University, or for those of us who went to Armstrong, it's just Armstrong, where he's been teaching since 1993. He's worked extensively in archaeology, historic preservation, and museum interpretation with many organizations, including Colonial Williamsburg, Old Salem, and the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts. And I would like to also say he was my professor just a few years ago, but he really helped me kind of move into the public history realm, so I want to thank him for that. He is the author of numerous publications, including The Backcountry Towns of Colonial Virginia, Old Southern Cookery, which you worked on with your mother, right? And The Piedmont Towns of Colonial North Carolina. He received his Bachelor of Arts in History and English from Wake Forest University and his Master of Arts and Doctorate in History from the College of William and Mary in Virginia, where he specialized in early American history and material culture. So I want to give you a big welcome to the Archives and History Room and our series for the US 250.
Well, thank you very much. And I appreciate you all coming out on a hot, sticky Savannah day for this. One very important fact that people often forget when they're discussing the American Revolution is that the conflict was more than just a revolution. It was also a civil war, which found friends and neighbors, even family members, on opposing sides. Fully 1/4 of the colonists, 1 in 4, remained loyal to the crown and had no desire to create a new nation. In Georgia, which was the youngest of the colonies and the one that fit best in the English government's mercantile system, the percentage of loyalists was even higher. After France agreed to recognize the United States and form an alliance, Georgia, as a base of military operations, must have appeared very appealing to the British, who suddenly had to rethink their entire military strategy. So what I'm going to do today, because this is the first truly multinational battle taking part with people of different nations taking part. You have the French, you have Irish mercenaries who are coming with them. You have a free Haitian division which is coming with them, as well as the British. But instead of focusing on the international aspect, I thought what I would do today is simply look at it from the American perspective. And after all, it is our semi-quincentennial, so yay odds. All right, now, to fully understand the Battle of Savannah from an American point of view, you need to back up and look at Savannah's role in the years leading up to 1779. On the eve of the Revolution, Savannah was a small town consisting of about 450 buildings and a population of 1,600 people, 750 white, between 800 and 900 black. A British soldier described the town saying, "The houses lie scattered and are poorly built, mostly of wood. In short, the whole has a most wretched, miserable appearance." A Hessian soldier complained that the sand is so deep that it is just like walking through fresh fallen snow a foot deep. A man runs no small risk of being choked by the clouds of sand and dust. Don't you know the tourist people love those? Now, what made this small, poorly developed town important was the fact that it was the colonial capital and Georgia's main port of entry. Now, the first time political upheaval really began to occur occur in Georgia happened after Parliament passed the Stamp Act in 1765. James Habersham, president of the Royal Council, summed up the situation nicely when he observed, "How must every inhabitant shudder at the thought of this act taking place?" When the colonists protested, Georgia's agent in London, William Knox, defended the law. The Assembly fired him and later asked Benjamin Franklin to represent the colony's interest. Tensions ran high in the streets of Savannah, but for the most part, Royal Governor James Wright was able to keep a lid on things. Still, there were some demonstrations. On Guy Fawkes Day, November 5th, 4 days after the act went into effect, sailors dressed up one of their members as a stamp distributor on a scaffold and paraded him around town, leaving the crowd highly diverted by the humor of the tars. Even with such demonstrations, however, Georgia was one of only 4 colonies that did not send any delegates to the Stamp Act Congress in New York. Governor Wright persuaded them not to go, though one observer went over the governor's objections. When the act went into effect, November 1st, 1765, there wasn't a single stamp salesman left in the colonies. That's because mobs had threatened them all into resigning, except in Georgia. Here, George Angus, Georgia's stamp agent, didn't arrive until January of 1766. The stamps arrived on board the ship Speedwell, which landed without protest. They were moved under guard to Fort Halifax, which stood in Trustee's Garden. Excuse me. Later, a mob of about 200 people gathered to seize the stamps, but Governor Wright and 50 soldiers had them back down. Georgia has the dubious distinction of being the only colony which issued any stamps in the colonies before Parliament overturned the act. That was because Governor Wright insisted that they be used on the paperwork required to release the 60-odd ships that were here in port. When the Charleston Sons of Liberty heard about it, they were livid, declaring, "No provision should be shipped to that infamous colony, Georgia, that every vessel trading there should be burnt, and whosoever trafficked with them should be put to death." They were pissed. George Angus stayed in Savannah all of 2 weeks, and then, to relieve the tensions, moved to the countryside for 2 months until things blew over. The next altercation with Parliament came in 1767 with the passage of the Townshend duties, a series of import taxes, a portion of which were to be used to pay the salaries of colonial officials. Since Georgia's officials, unlike the other 12 colonies, were already paid directly by England, it was hard for anybody here to really get very excited about it. Councilman Jonathan Bryan complained, but the king ordered Governor Wright to have him removed from the council. When local rangers requisitioned provisions under the Quartering Act that same year, the Assembly took a stand and refused to comply. 2 months later, they voluntarily gave the soldiers a stipend. Are you beginning to get the idea that when you're thinking about the events of Savannah in the Revolution, one key word should come to mind? Confusion. In 1774, when Parliament passed the Intolerable Acts following the Boston Tea Party, Georgia didn't exactly rally to the cause of the Patriots to the north. The Sons of Liberty held meetings at Peter Tondy's Tavern on Broughton Street. But Georgia was the only colony which did not send delegates to the First Continental Congress. Then shots were fired at Lexington and Concord. News of the battle arrived in Savannah May 10th, 1775, and the Patriots took action. They broke into Fort Halifax, stole 600 pounds of gunpowder. Then, in June, persons unknown spiked the 21 cannon protecting the city and threw them down the bluff to what's now River Street. Governor Wright had them hauled back up again, repaired, and they were in working order in time to fire salutes for the King's birthday. He gave, according to the papers, a genteel entertainment at the courthouse to the members of the council and the assembly, the public officers of the militia, and several other gentlemen. But at the same time, there was a second party going on. The Sons of Liberty erected a liberty pole, then proceeded to Tondy's Tavern in utmost harmony and concluded the evening in great decorum. But they too drank toasts to the King. The delicate, confused dance the people of Georgia were performing was becoming impossible to continue. People who didn't want to were forced to start choosing sides. James Habersham wrote in 1775, "Father against son and son against father, nearest relations and friends combating with each other, cutting each other's throats. It's dreadful to think of, much less to experience." He was right. Families were dividing, often on generational lines. Members of the first generation of colonists to Georgia, such as Noble Jones and Habersham himself, remained loyal to the crown, while watching their sons, Noble Wimberley Jones and James, John, and Joseph Habersham, choose to side with the Patriots. And as people chose sides, things grew violent. The Sons of Liberty, upset at a ship's pilot named John Hopkins, aped a practice going on in other colonies when they tarred and feathered him in Johnson Square, carted him around the town for 3 hours, threatening to hang him unless he toasted damnation to all Tories and success to American liberty. They formed a committee of safety, which threatened Hayden Smith, the rector at Christ Church, when he refused to observe a fast and preach a sermon as directed by the Continental Congress. Then finally, the first provincial Congress met at Tondy's and elected Noble Wimberley Jones, Archibald Bullock, and John Houston as representatives to attend the Second Continental Congress. But only 5 parishes were represented at that meeting, and so the 3 refused to go. People living in that hotbed of patriotic fervor in the colony, St. John's Parish around Midway, were so angry that they tried to secede from Georgia. They elected Lyman Hall to go to Philadelphia, but it didn't come to that. The Patriots held a second meeting with wider representation, re-elected Jones, Bullock, Houston, and Lyman Hall to appease the people of St. John's. But to balance Hall, they also added independent Presbyterian church pastor John Zubley. Zubley was noted for his fiery sermons fiercely defending American rights, but he was also an avowed monarchist. He would never vote for independence. While all of this was going on, royal government is still operating here in Savannah. But that changed when British ships arrived off Tybee in 1776. The Committee of Safety ordered Governor Wright's arrest, and Major Joseph Habersham did it single-handedly, plucking him from the middle of a council meeting. The committee put him under house arrest at his home on the site of the Telfair House, only to let him escape during the night. He got to Tybee, boarded a ship, and sailed to England. Without an operating government, in April, The Patriots created a state constitution and elected Archibald Bullock as Georgia's first president. Things finally seemed to be clear in Georgia. When Congress passed the Declaration of Independence, news reached Savannah August 8th. The Patriots read the document around town 3 times and burnt the king in effigy. But the new government was far from stable. President Bullock died 3 weeks later, and the Assembly replaced him with interim president and commander-in-chief Button Gwinnett, one of Georgia's signers of the Declaration. In the spring of 1777, instead of thinking about the defense of the capital, some Georgians were salivating at the prospect of invading Florida. Militia leader General Lachlan McIntosh proposed the idea to the Assembly, and when they voted down the plan, McIntosh called Gwinnett a scoundrel and lying rascal. In the 18th century, them's fighting words. Now remember, these guys are supposedly on the same side. Offended, Gwinnett challenged McIntosh to a duel in the middle of the Revolution. They met May 16, 1777 in Governor Wright's cow pasture. Both men shot each other, were wounded. Gwinnett more seriously. He died 12 days later. McIntosh thought it better for some reason if he left Georgia, so he went north to serve with George Washington. Which leads us to the first Battle of Savannah. British troops landed at Tybee December 23rd, 1778. There were 2,000 of them. In a futile delaying action, South Carolinian John Smith tried to slow their advance with his 40 men. The man Congress had placed in charge of Southern defenses was General Benjamin Lincoln, for whom the street is named. It's not after Abraham. In September, he was ordered to replace General Robert Howe, who had been more noted for his attention to women than for his defense of Savannah. Lincoln had yet to arrive, so Howe was still in charge. He hastily chose a site to make a stand, but he was not the only person giving orders. George Walton was in charge of the state militia, and Governor John Houston, although he had no military experience, started issuing orders as well. There was almost no coordination between the 3 men or any of the troops. Houston and Howe hated each other so much the two barely even spoke. It should be no wonder then that the First Battle of Savannah was a disaster. Howe believed that his position on a road coming from Tybee was impregnable, having burned a bridge and diverted a creek to force the British straight into his path. But he hadn't counted on the animosity of black Americans. One elderly enslaved man, Comino Quash Dolly, showed the British the path through a marsh, outflanking Howe's position. December 29th, 1778, catching him completely by surprise. It was a rout. There was utter chaos as Howe's men fled the field. It was at high tide, and many of the Americans drowned as they tried to escape through the swamps. At the end of the day, 83 Americans had been killed in battle, 30 more had drowned. The British had lost 7 dead. More importantly, they captured 48 cannon, 23 mortars, and 94 barrels of gunpowder. They also took 550 American soldiers. Archibald Campbell, who led them, was absolutely delighted because, among other people, they took Mordecai Sheftel, the head of Georgia's commissary, and his son, Sheftel, who hadn't escaped because he couldn't swim. 5 days after the battle, General Lincoln arrived. With the British fully ensconced in the city, headed by General Augustin Prevost, they believed that the loyalist sentiment was so strong that they could easily take charge. They offered amnesty to anyone who renounced independence, 10 guineas reward for the capture of any assemblyman, and 2 guineas for any insurgent caught coming from South Carolina. They were absolutely convinced that loyalist sentiment was so strong here that it had to be outside agitators that persuaded anybody into rebellion. Hundreds of people took the oath and joined the British militia units. Governor Wright returned in July, and from then to the end of the war, Georgia had 2 operating governments. Some surprising people supported the British, including James Johnston, the editor of the Georgia Gazette, who had vehemently protested against the Stamp Act. He was now publishing the Royal Georgia Gazette and supporting the Loyalist cause. John Zupley, that delegate to the Second Continental Congress, became a British chaplain, and he turned Independent Presbyterian Church into a hospital for Haitian soldiers. The city's population swelled as loyalists who had fled to Florida or had gone into hiding joined the British ranks, and thousands of enslaved blacks came, tempted by the promise of freedom. And so the confused scene was now set for the Second Battle of Savannah. One of the first things that the British did was to fortify the city. To defend on the land side, they built a series of earthworks known as redoubts. But they were more concerned about the French fleet. And so to take care of that, they decided to block the main entrance to Savannah, which at the time was a cut between what's now Hutchinson Island and at the time a separate island. Today they are connected. There they sank an old warship, the HMS Rose. They removed the cannon, stripped the ship, and blocked the channel. When the French fleet did arrive, they blocked the remaining channel. Fast forward to 5 years ago. As the Army Corps of Engineers was deepening the channel as part of the harbor improvement process, interesting artifacts began to come up, including an anchor and no fewer than 19 cannon, which may have been aboard 3 smaller vessels the British sank hastily to block the French approach: the Venus, the Savannah, and a third ship whose name we don't know. For the last several years, these cannon have been down at Galveston, Texas, in a laboratory being treated. They have just returned. They arrived last week and will be put on display, I believe, at Revolutionary Park. With Georgia's patriot government in chaos, the call to retake the city came mostly from frightened South Carolinians. The President of Congress, South Carolinian Henry Lawrence, pushed Congress to send more troops. Congress did, sending that great American leader, Count Casimir Pulaski, and his legion. Meanwhile, South Carolina's governor, John Rutledge, sent letters to the French Admiral Henri d'Estaing begging him to send the fleet, which he did, he sent 30 ships with 4,000 French, Irish, and Haitian troops. Lachlan McIntosh was back, gathering up anyone he could find to serve in the Georgia militia. He pulled together 300 volunteers, mostly South Carolinians, but also some men from as far away as Virginia. And they were even joined by Francis Marion, the swamp fox, who came down. But D'Estaing arrived first. On September 16th, he demanded that British General Prevost surrender to the King of France before Lincoln and McIntosh had even arrived. By the time everybody finally did show up, the British had brought in reinforcements from Sunbury and Beaufort. They had dug in and they were ready. No one had bothered to try and stop them. The word that best describes the scenes as the Americans and the French attempt to join their first joint military operation: confusion. The Americans and the French had very different ideas of what they were doing in this war. The Americans would have liked nothing better than for the French to sweep in, take charge, and force the English out of the country. But they weren't going to do that. They had only joined the war following the Battle of Saratoga, where after 2 years of fighting, the Americans finally had demonstrated that they had the will and the ability to win battles. The French were hesitant to join the fray, as evidenced by D'Estaing moving ahead against the British. They just didn't trust the Americans. One officer wrote, "The Americans are so badly armed, so badly clothed, and I must say, so badly commanded, that we could never turn them to much account." The Americans had the will, but not the discipline to fight well, at least by European standards. The plan D'Estaing developed called for the Allies to lay in siege to soften up the British defenses. The armies were arranged in 5 camps. See them at the top of the screen. 3 American and 2 French. This, to give you perspective, that would roughly be Victory Drive, to give you an idea of how far they were. The Americans were not allowed into the French camps. The siege started October 3rd, after McIntosh sent Prevost a request to evacuate women and children, including his own family. But Prevost refused. The first shots went wild, and it took a while before the French artillery honed in on their targets, purportedly because instead of receiving a barrel of beer for provisions, that morning they had mistakenly been sent a barrel of rum. Eventually, though, they got it right and started striking Savannah's buildings, some as many as 50 times. The British, who were in short supply of cannonballs, paid children 6 pence for every French cannonball they recovered so they could shoot it back. Despite the property damage, only 1 British soldier died during the bombardment, though that wasn't true for the civilians. Oops. United States Major John Jones wrote, "A number of the poor women and children have already been put to death by our bombs and cannon. Many of them were killed in their beds, and amongst others, a poor woman with her infant in arms were destroyed by a cannonball. A more cruel war could not exist than this. Some 40 civilians were killed." After 6 days, it was clear that the barrage wasn't working. Once again, honor, that same sense of honor that had caused Gwinnett and McIntosh to duel, convinced D'Estaing he needed to attack the city instead of lifting the siege. When he informed his officers of the decision, only one of them, the 23-year-old Louis-Marie Vicomte de Noailles, protested. D'Estaing ignored him, saying his views were those of an old man. The plan for the attack was complex and confusing, requiring the cooperation of international forces and nighttime maneuvers, difficult at any time, but particularly in the 18th century. The idea was that the Americans would attack in the east, on this side. However, that was a diversion. The real assault was on the other side, at the location that we now know of as the Spring Hill Redoubt. This is a recreation, by the way. The actual fort was in the middle of Louisville Road, and so when they reconstructed it at a slightly smaller scale, they moved it about 100 yards. That redoubt was commanded by Colonel John Maitland. According to tradition, James Curry, an American serving the Charleston Grenadiers, deserted to the British the day before the battle and informed them of the plan to attack Spring Hill because it was the weakest. There may have been an informer or spies, or it may simply be that Colonel Maitland realized that he was undermanned. At any rate, by the time the attack occurred, the redoubt had been reinforced. When the diversionary assaults came, the British paid little attention. The Battle of Savannah, October 9th, 1779, lasted 1 hour. And yet, it was the second bloodiest battle of the American Revolution, only Bunker Hill seeing more casualties. Confusion reigned as the Allied troops hurtled towards the redoubt. Pulaski, hoping to rally them and inspire the populace, took 200 men and began riding towards the combat when he was mortally wounded. D'Estaing later said the Count fell by his own fault, placing himself where he should not have been at that moment, explaining that Pulaski prematurely advanced in order to avail himself more promptly of a passage we had opened for him. The Allies almost succeeded in retaking Savannah, but in the end it was not to be. When the order to retreat came, there are varying accounts of what happened. In some versions, Maitland counterattacked but turned aside when he saw an orderly withdrawal. Others reported that there was such confusion that no 10 American soldiers arrived from the same unit at any one time. And the only reason they weren't slaughtered was because de Noailles, the old man who had fought against doing this in the first place, came to their aid and rescued them. They ended up seeking refuge at the site of the Jewish cemetery, which was walled. And if you're not familiar, it is tucked right in between the interstate and 17, where it breaks off to go over the bridge. Accounts also vary as to the number of casualties. British accounts place their figures at 18 killed, 39 wounded, while the Allies lost between 750 and 1,100. From an American perspective, what was the aftermath and the legacy of the Battle of Savannah? Well, not surprisingly, it's confusing. Washington tried to put a good face on things. He wrote General Lincoln, "While I regret the misfortune, I feel very sensible pleasure in contemplating the gallant behavior of the officers and men of the French and American army. And it adds not a little to my consolation to learn that instead of mutual reproaches, which too often follow the failure of enterprises, between the cooperation of different nations, their confidence and esteem for each other's are increased. Well, that wasn't entirely true. A lot of blame was flying. The French were blaming the Americans were blaming the French, and a lot of people were pointing fingers at disdain. But then, Georgia's legislature turned right around and granted the Count 20,000 acres of land and gave him citizenship in appreciation of his efforts. Some good did come out of the Battle of Savannah for the Americans. Immediately, the death of Count Pulaski gave the Americans a martyr. And if British propaganda about the Count's military prowess was even remotely true, Pulaski did more good for the Americans by dying than he would have as a cavalry officer. Cities, towns, roads, bridges were named after a fallen hero, a nobleman sacrificing himself for American liberty. It was truly inspiring. Similarly, another hero, Sergeant William Jasper, mythologized by Parson Weems in 1809 through accounts of releasing American prisoners and dying during the battle trying to save a regimental flag, was born. The tales may not have been exactly true, but the legend was real, bringing pride and inspiration during the 19th century, particularly in both Georgia and South Carolina. So much so that the Irish, thinking Jasper was actually Irish, erected this statue to him. Unfortunately, he was German. His name was Wilhelm Gaspar, and it got anglicized to William Jasper. You gotta love Savannah. Another legend born here, Henri Christophe, who later became the Emperor of Haiti after the Haitian Revolution, is remembered in the monument to the Haitian soldiers, represented as the drummer boy to the left. He may have fought in the Battle of Savannah. There were some practical benefits from the battle as well. When D'Estaing appeared with the French fleet off the Georgia coast, the British pulled their forces out of Rhode Island in order to counter the move, freeing that colony, which became the base of operations for the French. The French presence off Georgia was also lucrative financially. They seized $738,000 worth of British assets. And finally, there may have been the long-term effect of this tale of confusion. The British arrived in Georgia banking on the fact that the colony was full of loyalist support. After the battle, they may have been lulled into the belief that the continued loyalist support would propel them to victory throughout the South and ultimately in all of the colonies. They moved up into South Carolina and 7 months later captured Charleston. But then began the long march through Carolina's backcountry and the constant harassment by American patriots, which ultimately forced Lord Cornwallis to seek refuge in a little Virginia port called Yorktown, the last battlefield of the American Revolution. There, possibly because of the poor coordination that had taken place here, the American and French military worked together seamlessly, finally bringing American independence, which, from an American perspective, after all, was the whole point. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, sir.
I read something not long ago that gave a little bit different perspective than I've heard before about Stamp Act and the other taxes. Just that was Parliament actually trying to recoup the cost of defending the colonies during the French and Indian War.
Absolutely. The problem with the Stamp Act was that it was the first direct revenue-raising tax that Parliament had ever put forward. All of the other revenue taxes had been done by the local assemblies in each of the colonies. And by putting on this tax on paper, they alienated the people who would become their worst enemies. Lawyers, merchants, clergymen, they're the people who are using the most paper. They're the ones most affected, and so the effect was devastating. Yes, sir.
I'll add a little bit to that. The British government was heavily in debt as a result of the
Absolutely, they had doubled the national debt during the 7 Years' War.
Which lasted from 1755 to 1763, and nobody on earth benefited more from the results of that war than the American colonies did. So we should have been more than happy to pay our share of the cost of that war. The 7 Years' War.
Absolutely. There was a lot of miscommunication. After a period of what's referred to as benign neglect, the colonies, I like to tell my students, the colonies had kind of grown up. Now they were adolescents. But they had basically raised themselves. And now here come mom and dad and suddenly start putting restrictions on. It's like, I don't like that boy you're hanging out with. I want you home at 10 o'clock, et cetera, et cetera. And that's a recipe for ending up on Jerry Springer. And the miscommunication, that was all pervasive in the years between 1763 and shots being fired in 1775, it was just amazing. Other questions? Yes, sir.
The embankments at the top of this picture there that you said were put in, or do they remain at all?
They do not remain, only archaeologically. Rita Elliott will probably refer to an excavation which took place in Madison Square. That's where the Jasper Green Monument is located. There, they found remains of one of the British redoubts. And then, of course, there's the one that was, I want to say reconstructed. That's a good word for it. I know the archaeological remains of those have been found. But, as time came on, they were just flattened out, used for fill, etc. No longer part of the landscape. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
It doesn't relate exactly to this, but what happens between Yorktown and us getting the Constitution and Congress coming together? Who's ruling who? What do people feel like? The British are still kind of in charge because the treaty doesn't get signed for so many years. How does that work?
Savannah and New York City are under British control until 1783, when the peace treaty is finally emerged. So the British are in charge here. The American government is based in Augusta, upriver. So that's what's happening here specifically. Mostly they're just kind of sitting back waiting for the negotiations to conclude in Paris.
Are there any skirmishes between the...
Not that I know of.
We just put up with you.
They may have been.
Okay.
The British were pretty much isolated. They were surrounded. And Washington, very wisely, knew to keep an American army in the field. If he had let the soldiers go, then the British could have broken out of New York, restarted the campaign. There are all kinds of different possibilities. Now, the economy was in turmoil.
Sure.
Congress, operating under the Articles of Confederation, could not tax. They could only borrow money or print money. Soldiers hadn't paid. There was a mutiny. The American army they were so irate at Congress, they wanted to make Washington a king. And fortunately for us, he calmed it down, stepped away, and it didn't happen. Eventually, a series of events lead to the Constitutional Convention in 1787, where they basically realized that the government had been enough to get them through the war but they really needed to have a revised government that, among other things, would let them tax and actually pay for things. And that was how we ended up with our current constitution.
Thank you, I appreciate
You're
that.
very welcome. Well, again, let me thank you for taking time out on a hot Friday lunch. And do you want to say anything else?
Well, I want to say thank you to you.